Hello, my name is Mirtl. I'm coordinating the eLTER ESFRI process, and today we'll briefly present eLTER, the Integrated European Long-Term Ecosystem Critical Zone and Socio-Ecological Research and the related infrastructure development. This presentation is mainly targeting at eLTER scientists and the eLTER community. What you see is that eLTER deals with a distributed in-situ research infrastructure, so a network of well-equipped sites across Europe, and eLTER, of course, aims at filling a critical gap in continental scale science, ecosystem science, which enables integrated research on entire ecosystems, and all that aims at providing decision-making and management with proper knowledge and information towards sustainable and adaptive management under global and climate change. These sites, here we have the sketch, the graph of archetypical eLTER sites are the bedrock of eLTER, and it's not only one site, but hundreds of sites in about 25 countries currently in Europe. And with this slide, I want to show what typically happens at an eLTER site. We have an area, delineated project area in the range of 1 to 100 square kilometers. Typically, we measure at these places all kinds of inputs and drivers, all kinds of output. And the main purpose of all these standard observations at the sites is to detect and explain environmental change, ecosystem change happening at the very site. In the bottom, you see the main characteristics. I mentioned the main drivers of change. So we are observing system structures and functions, and most importantly, the interaction of slow change and the fast disturbances happening simultaneously, and of course driving our design in terms of time and space of all the measurements and activities at these sites. Very importantly, eLTER is not standalone, but as much as it can interacts and collaborates with other research infrastructures and environmental monitoring networks, if possible, using the same basic infrastructure at the sites. We have a second category because you can imagine, looking at the scale shown here, that it would be difficult to carry out socio-ecological research at the scale of only 1 to 100 square kilometers. Socio-ecological research that aims at investigating human-environment interactions at the regional scale and also, of course, in the long term. To enable and support this kind of research, the second category, the socio-ecological research platforms, LTSER platforms, feature this regional scope in terms of scale, in terms of in-depth research on the dominating habitat types occurring within a given region and considering the local population and actor groups relevant in a given region. The main catchwords here are interdisciplinarity, cross-sector activities, and the production of relevant knowledge for decision-making. And ideally, this would happen in never-ending loops between the local decision makers raising their need for better information, for proper decision-making, science reacting on that, motivating the concrete research projects from interacting and consulting with the actor groups in the region, then of course doing research, transforming the results and feeding proper information back to the decision-making process. As regards the long-term development of eLTER in Europe, we are looking back at about 30 years history that was in the beginning of the story pretty much driven by bottom-up activities, bottom-up networking of eLTER sites across 26 countries. The framework for that was given by the global eLTER network, eLTER, And the eLTER is a network of basically national networks, country networks, with Europe currently dominating the global network of about 50 countries with its 26 country networks. As indicated, we have close to 500 eLTER sites and 35 LTSR platforms currently in Europe. Capitalizing on this asset, we started in 2003, having European scale eLTER flagship projects. So we had a series of projects where key partners from the 26 countries collaborated in the non-pattern of EC projects with a certain number of beneficiaries across these 27 countries. So we have eLTER movement, eLTER network development in 27 countries, despite having only in 26 countries formalized networks. And beyond that, since about 10 years, there was an initiative towards creating an eLTER ESFRI infrastructure. So that represents the highest level of formalization, and in terms of the therefore needed political commitment, we see a lower number of countries that are already politically committed, but still all the countries involved in the larger networking involve through scientific support, partly through financial support, and as said, 20 countries have, through the related ministries, political commitment to the eLTER ESFRI process. The basic relation between these three layers is recruiting from the bottom and standardizing and formalizing top down, with all the three layers interacting and influencing each other in this respect. Now, what is special about eLTER, and what is the core asset, and what is the differentiating characteristic of eLTER in comparison to other research infrastructure? eLTER features a whole system approach at all scales and at all site categories. And basically, we are all the time dealing with the interaction of the social system with the environment the social system capitalizes on, lives on, with the basic relation being that, of course, society derives ecosystem services, and through the usage influences the ecosystems, the environment, but there are also, of course, external drivers beyond that anthropogenic impact. The second component relates to scales. I indicated that sites are established at a certain scale, as are the LTSR platforms, and we have a quite complex pattern of within-scale feedback loops and interactions, and cross-scale feedback loops and interactions from the local to the continental and the global scale, and a conceptual framework describing that and structuring these interactions is the macrosystems ecology approach. As regards the human-environment interaction, we build on the pulse breath dynamics model published by Collins et al. 2011 and heavily used in all related communities. But of course, we appreciate that there are also alternative models. We don't go into detail here. If we combine these two components, so the horizontal component of these human-environment interactions that happen at each scale, and the scaling component of the macrosystems ecology, we get to WHALES, the whole system approach for in-situ research on life supporting system. And this graph here in the center represents this conceptual framework of eLTER. Very importantly, we need to recognize that the in-situ research can only happen at certain scales. I mentioned the sites, I mentioned the LTSR platforms, and beyond that, we achieve still some continental coverage in Europe, but we do that through a proper composition of the site network, covering the major European environmental and socio-ecological gradients. If we want to implement the whole system approach, it's clear that disciplinary communities need to interact with eLTER specificity, that they do that at the same places, the eLTER sites and the LTSR platforms. And LTER research challenges reflect that broad variety of disciplines that need to interact, ranging from research on biodiversity dynamics, climate change, eutrophication and pollution, and socioecology. And we indicate here in these slides the related political frameworks in Europe, because in the end, what eLTER does all the time relates to these political frameworks, and pretty much of eLTER's servicing and service provisioning and data production aims at feeding into these mechanisms and frameworks. This is the schematic representation that we think should invite the communities to engage and to collaborate at the eLTER sites, because we show here the compartments of ecosystems, the layers of ecosystems that are covered by eLTER standard observations and by eLTER research, reaching from the bedrock up to the lower atmosphere and touching these main elements you can see here. And all these compartments are covered at all the sites. So the whole systems approach is implemented at all the categories, irrespective of the level of instrumentation which these categories reflect. And the target is to establish and then in the long term operate eLTER at about 200 to 250 sites once the eLTER research infrastructure is formally established. eLTER provides this basic infrastructure operated in the long term, but also data nodes for integrating what we measure at the various sites, the standard observations, but also information from various other sources that's properly scaled, integrated, and put onto the service portals for seamless usage by the various scientific teams. So whatever is produced by any of the collaborating disciplines and in the observation activities of eLTER is seamlessly accessible across the disciplines for scientific analysis, modeling, etc. eLTER provides physical access to the sites and, of course, access to these data. Concerning the site categories, a little bit more detail. The site categories represent a hierarchy in costs, in instrumentation, and related to that, a hierarchy in terms of numbers of sites. So we can afford more sites of the more cheap categories, and of course less of the more expensive ones. And according to the explanation of the LTSER regions and platforms, there would be these elements that are of larger scale, and typically sites that cover the main habitat types occurring in a given landscape would be lying within these LTSER platforms. And the ongoing process across the eLTER countries is that the countries have to decide which categories of sites and which sites will form part of the national network. This will largely relate to the existing LTR networks, but we are now in the process of formalizing that in the context of an ESFRI research infrastructure. What we see here to the right is that we are lucky to, with the existing site network, cover the environmental zones of Europe already quite well. And of course, the selection process now ongoing will have to take care that this continues to be the case. It's extremely important, specifically for the eLTER community, to be aware of what it does and what it doesn't. So what's within the scope and what's outside the scope. And to show that to various stakeholders and decision makers in a consistent manner, we developed this sketch of the collaborative societal process towards sustainable management of our resources and sustainable environmental policies, where from the policy sector to the left and the management sector to the left, there is information need. What eLTER does is basically to respond to data and information need, to measure, to interpret, to produce high-level data products, and if possible, provide tailor-made information for the decision-making. But then there comes the point of handover into the societal and policy sector, where eLTER can again, in the end, still observe what further information is needed, but eLTER cannot actually advise beyond its capabilities and push decision-making in the area where it's actually by definition not active. I have mentioned the political frameworks eLTER is working towards. We have the small list here, the adaptation to climate change strategy, biodiversity strategy, habitats directive, water framework directive, and more recently, the NEC directive, where eLTER is directly mentioned in the annex. There is a much longer list, but these are the most prominent ones. This slide shows you that to provide services, you need structure. And to the right, you see the basic structural components of eLTER. We have the LTSR platforms and the sites. And these two categories of elements comprise the national research infrastructure, so the national networks of sites. We have central services providing services and a service portal through which the services can be approached. And there is a basic grouping of these services, one of them focusing on the access, both physically to the sites and to the data. The second one is all about data and production of high-level tailored data products. And as mentioned, a key focus of eLTER will be to integrate information from the various sources beyond its own measurements at the sites. And then a third block of services focusing on project support beyond the actual, of course, eLTER scientific communities, work on research, technology, research and development, innovative methods and measurements, and last but not least, also education and training, both internally and for external customers. We have been showing this one archetypical result, which we think can only be produced by integrating abiotic and biotic information and involving cross-disciplinary research teams. This is not to say that this kind of result should be or can be produced at every site, but it's a typical result, we think. And of course, you could think of other topical foci and information needs. What you see here is a false color remote sensing based image of a landscape in Germany. That's an LTSR platform operated by Terreno in Germany. And you can see the land use, also the land use gradient within that landscape. And that gradient basically is a gradient of land use intensity and also a gradient in terms of the share of natural landscape in the area, in a given area. And the larger, the smaller rectangles and the yellow dots represent pollinator traps. The focus of this cluster of studies was to see how the loss of pollinators could be compensated by something. This was the question, what is it? And the outcome is shown in this graph. So to the left on the y-axis, you see the pollinator species richness. On the x-axis, the mean temperature. And what we see is that if the share of semi-natural landscape is only 2% in a landscape, there is still a quite pronounced decline of pollinator species richness with increasing temperature. However, if the share of semi-natural landscape increases up to 7%, 12%, and 17%, we can say that spatial planning and the management is really challenged here, because through a proper share of semi-natural landscape, the pollinator species richness loss through temperature rise can be compensated for. So that's the key message, and we think that's both scientifically interesting, but of highest relevance for the local and regional, but also, of course, beyond that decision making. We do what we do not in isolation, and the next slide shows you our positioning in the larger environmental research infrastructures landscape. And we must underpin that this is a picture that was produced in consensus amongst a cluster of environmental research infrastructures in the ENVRI plus community context. If we look at the decisive triangle between energy, matter, and information, we can explain the eternally turning circle between ecosystem structures, change, in this case, the human usage of ecosystem services, the impact of that usage on processes, and of course the structure, the reorganization of the system, and then yet another status of the ecosystem structure. And this wheel has been turning for centuries, millennia, tens of millennia, and considering which infrastructure in Europe focuses on which aspect in this actually information challenge, we see eLTER sitting in the very core area as an observational ecosystem research infrastructure, together with ANAI, which carries out experiments. And so these two infrastructures are pretty much focusing on a better understanding of ecosystem functioning at a quite low scale and with a high level of detail. Various other infrastructures like the Nubius focus on larger scale, for example, in the case of the Nubius, then sediment transport in larger rivers and the impact of that on coastal ecosystem and transitional waters. We see ICOS here focusing on atmospheric measurements at the continental scale, and we have infrastructures that sit more on the information side, like the e-infrastructure on biodiversity, LifeWatch, and DISPO focusing on the digitization of natural history museum collections. Whatever we do also in Europe always has a close look on what's happening globally. One of the key reference networks, of course, is the global LTR network, but eLTER also just entered a collaboration towards a global ecosystem research infrastructure, JERI, with peers from 5 continents. And eLTER has been quite successful also already during the early stages in feeding into global processes and developments, both conceptually with the whole system approach, but also through tools and services like a globally used registry for observation sites, the DAMES SDR. Last but not least, only one slide on what we want to produce in terms of organizational structures. The eLTER research infrastructure will have central components. It will be a legal entity, and what's going to be within that legal entity and outside is not finally decided. That's part of the natural development process of an infrastructure. The head office in charge of the central operation will also operate a service portal that gives access to the various services in service bundles. We will have topic centers covering matters from 4 thematic service areas we specified, not indicating that each of them will be a topic center or only one topic center. It's about quality assurance for data modeling and analytical tools, design interoperability and synthesis that involves all the interactions with other RISE and synthesis science, and of course technical innovation and development. And the bottom and backbone and foundation of all that will of course be the set of national research infrastructures in hopefully more than 20 sites. Last but not least, there is a timeline, and the timeline is tough. We currently manage 2 flagship projects, the eLTER PPP focusing on formalization aspects of the infrastructure, and the eLTER Plus, which is the science component, the science angle, closely linking the development of the RI to true scientific needs, and also piloting service solutions that will then be, of course, extended in the course of the implementation of the research infrastructure. We like to compare that with the construction of the Eiffel Tower, which took quite a while, but then now you have the fancy Eiffel Tower and everyone is keen on taking a selfie. in front of the Eiffel Tower, and we do hope that eLTER will end in something like that in the area of ecosystem research. And our credo is that if we want to create something fascinating and long-lasting like the eLTER that lasts quite a while, might be a decade overall since the preparations for the major projects. But we think that if we go fast, we can go quite far, and in the end get to what the vision is, namely support a kind of science that's truly capable of providing the information for humanity, for Europe specifically, to adapt to these challenges. We can see almost in every news the challenges of global change, of climate change, and for a better future for our children. Thank you very much.